Welcome to the Compass for Being Human, where we educate the ego, emotions, and philosophy for men. There's a quiet pattern running underneath many of the problems we talk about when we talk about men, masculinity, and social harm. It's not loud and it's not obvious, but it shapes behavior more powerfully than most surface-level debates ever could. That pattern is this: the people with the most social permission are often the least encouraged to develop self-awareness. And when self-awareness finally becomes unavoidable, it feels not like growth, but like a threat to their identity. This matters because self-awareness is not a luxury trait. It's the foundation of moral responsibility. Without it, a person can follow rules, perform goodness, or mimic empathy, but they cannot genuinely be accountable. They can only react when consequences appear. And in societies structured around male dominance, men are often protected from the kinds of consequences that force reflection in the first place. From a young age, many boys are taught to act rather than reflect, to push forward rather than look inward, to assert rather than examine. Movement is praised, momentum is rewarded. Questioning oneself is framed as weakness, hesitation, or overthinking. Over time, this creates a version of masculinity that is deeply uncomfortable with stillness, introspection, and emotional literacy. Not because men are incapable of these things, but because they were never required to develop them. And here's the uncomfortable truth: power does not want self-aware participants. A self-aware person is harder to manipulate, harder to predict, and harder to excuse. Self-awareness interrupts automatic behavior. It creates friction between impulse and action. It forces a person to ask not just can I, but should I, and who does this affect? Systems built on hierarchy and entitlement do not benefit from those questions being asked too often by those at the top. This is why reflection has been feminized, why therapy is mocked, why men who speak openly about emotions are treated as exceptions rather than norms, why emotional intelligence is framed as optional, secondary, or irrelevant to real strength. Because emotional awareness doesn't just make someone kinder, it makes them accountable. And accountability destabilizes unearned power. Instead, many men grow up inside what we might call social permission structures. These are the invisible rules that decide who is allowed to fail without consequence, who is allowed to be incompetent without shame, who is allowed to express anger without being labeled dangerous, and who is protected when harm occurs. Masculinity comes with a wide permission slip. Men are often allowed to not know, not notice, not participate, and not improve, because someone else will absorb the current. This is where concepts like weaponized incompetence are often misunderstood. It's not simply laziness, it's socially protected incapacity. A man is not punished for failing to learn domestic skills, emotional skills, or relational skills in the same way a woman is. The world quietly reassures him, this isn't really your responsibility. Someone else will handle it. Over time, this creates resentment toward accountability, because accountability feels like an unfair demand rather than a normal expectation. What's striking is that many men don't experience a responsibility as empowering. They experience it as oppressive, not because responsibility is inherently burdensome, but because they were never trained for it. Responsibility builds internal structure. It creates competence, self-trust, and resilience. But if you grow up protected from responsibility, it will feel like punishment when it finally arrives. And when accountability does arrive, through social change, feminist critique, or personal conflict, many men don't experience it as information. They experience it as annihilation. This is where resistance hardens into hostility. Not because the critique is wrong, but because their identity is built externally, on dominance, on approval, on being right, on being the good guy by default. When identity is fused to role, any challenge to the role feels like an attack on existence itself. This is why "I didn't mean to" is treated as a full defense, why intention is elevated above impact, why apologies feel humiliating, why being wrong feels unbearable. For men who were never taught to build an internal sense of self, Being wrong doesn't feel like learning, and it feels like becoming nothing. This is also why movements toward equality are framed as loss. Equality doesn't take anything away materially, but it removes unexamined advantage. And for someone whose self-worth was built on that advantage, the loss feels existential. Change requires ego death, and ego death feels violent to people who don't have a stable self underneath the ego. What often goes unnamed is that emotional illiteracy is not neutral. It doesn't just limit personal growth, it creates harm. A man who cannot identify his emotions will externalize them. Frustration becomes anger. Insecurity becomes control. Shame becomes contempt. Loneliness becomes entitlement. Without emotional vocabulary, these feelings don't disappear. They leak outward into relationships, workplaces, families, and communities. This is where society's obsession with good men becomes dangerous, because being good is often framed as passive, as not being the worst, as having good intentions. But goodness without self-awareness is fragile. It collapses the moment discomfort appears. Real moral character is not about self-image. It's about the willingness to be disrupted by reality and still respond with integrity. A man who refuses self-examination will always default to power when challenged. He will lean on dominance, deflection, or denial. Not because he is evil, but because he lacks internal tools. This is why accountability from other men matters so deeply. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is permission. When men say nothing in the face of misogyny, harm, or dehumanization, they are not staying out of it. They are reinforcing the structure that allows it to continue. Good men are not defined by private beliefs alone. They are defined by what they interrupt, what they refuse to laugh at, what they challenge when it costs them social comfort. Justice is not cruelty. Accountability is not hatred. Naming harm is not the same as becoming harmful. A society that confuses forgiveness with virtue while avoiding accountability becomes a paradise for narcissists and abusers. This is why self-awareness is revolutionary. It dismantles excuses. It removes the safety net of ignorance. It forces a person to see not just who they believe themselves to be, but how they actually move through the world. And that is terrifying for anyone whose identity depends on never being questioned. But here is the hopeful truth. Men are not incapable of this work. They have simply been undertrained and overprotected. Emotional literacy is not weakness. It is discipline. Reflection is not passivity. It is courage. Accountability is not humiliation. It is the pathway to genuine self-respect. The strongest men are not those who dominate others or protect their ego at all costs. They are the ones who can sit with discomfort without fleeing, who can hear critique without collapsing, who can change without feeling erased, who can build an internal sense of worth that doesn't depend on superiority, permission, or silence. If masculinity is to have a future that is ethical, relational, and sustainable, it must move away from entitlement and toward responsibility, away from reflex and toward reflection, away from power over others and toward mastery of the self. That is not the end of masculinity. It is its evolution. And the question every man eventually faces is not, am I good? But am I willing to be accountable when I'm not? Because growth does not come from being protected. It comes from being honest. And honesty, practiced consistently, is what turns power into integrity. Thank you for watching. If this resonated with you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos.